Good afternoon. I'm really proud to introduce Dr. Robert Haze. Dr. Haze is a Royal College of Surgeons accredited implant training practitioner and accredited mentor in implant industry with the Association of Dental Implantology. He has marked assessments for the Royal College implantology candidate for several years and mentors dentists in all aspects of implant industry, including Nobel Gate technology. Dr. Haze sees patients with advanced or complicated implant cases. He's one of the pioneers of Zygoma implants. I welcome Robert Haze for the next presentation. Thank you. I was looking for you. I couldn't see you there.
Thanks. Could somebody who owns this laptop come and set up my slide for me? Thanks. I'm aware that speaking after lunch is sometimes a challenge. So how many of you are feeling tired? Oh, not very many. That's great. How many of you actually currently place implants? And how many of you currently are in practice in the UK? And how many are looking for a job? Brilliant. So you can tell by the colour of my hair that I've been doing this for 40 years. And I somehow developed a passion when I was at dental school for looking after the people who hate coming to the dentist, people who have the worst dental health. And in those days, we used to call it blood and plastic. So I was trained to take the teeth out of a human being in 3 minutes, because the way we used to work in those days, we did not use local anaesthetic. So as students, we were divided into pairs, and one was the anaesthetist, and from the moment the mask went over the nose, there were 3 minutes to finish the treatment. Now, that has left me, if you like, with a certain degree of skill, but not a skill that I have applied for most of my professional life until more recently. I've been privileged to be able to be in practice in a wealthy part of the UK and spent most of my life trying to save teeth. So I've done a lot of endodontic treatment, and I've done a lot of perio treatment as a general practitioner. And when dental implants started to come into the literature, I thought it was madness. The idea of putting metal screws into mouths. Mouths are infected. You're going to have problems. And in one sense, I think that was a correct reaction. But after a while, I started to realize there was some benefit, because people lose teeth. However hard we try, there is a risk that our patients will lose teeth. And if we put dental implants into mouths which are losing teeth, we can create another problem where the patients start to lose implants. And that's a shame. So I started to investigate very carefully what was happening when people started to lose implants. And one of the most important things in implant dentistry is to avoid putting implants into unstable occlusions, mouths which have got progressive breakdown. And once you've identified a mouth that has terminal breakdown, you are better off considering clearing the dentition, which takes me back to the blood and plastic dentistry. So that's where my talk starts, and unfortunately you've got to wait till the end of the afternoon to ask any questions. But I hope that you'll challenge me. So, I've used a large number of different implant systems, and I want to talk to you today specifically about the one that I'm using at the moment, because I don't think it's just my favourite system. Rather like my career, dental implants have matured over the last 50 years. And what I'm going to show you today, I think, combines the best out of what has gone before. Great. So what is Neodent? Well, it's something new to us in the UK, but it's been going around for 23 years. It's actually the 4th largest implant system in the world, and it has probably the largest production facility of any implant company. It's got many, many scientific articles backing up its use. But what am I going to talk about today? I'm going to talk specifically about mouths that require clearance or mouths that have had a clearance before. In other words, terminally dentate patients and edentulous patients. That's what I'm basing my talk on. It's an all-on-4 concept. Now, we're looking here at bioengineering. As we noticed problems with implants failing, we started to identify two possible reasons. One was overloading, trauma, force, weakening the bone around the implant. In other words, if you keep hitting your kneecap with a hammer, it's going to get red and the bone will become soft and inflamed. Or bacteria. And we have tended, as a dental profession, to think of bacteria in terms of plaque. We've tended to think of implant infections like tooth infections. So we've thought of external surfaces holding plaque. And therefore we've tended to treat implants that are failing like teeth that are failing. But one of the biggest problems that we've created in implant dentistry is a well of infection. When we started with implants, they were pretty nice, solid, with a little bolt on the top, a little hex sticking out the top. It's not the best way of joining things together, but at least there wasn't a well inside to grow bugs. But we moved on to get a stronger connection between the abutment, onto which we place our prosthetic components, and the implant, and thereby created a well below bone level to breed and exude bacteria. Looking back, that wasn't wise. But it's the state that we're in at the moment. And my own belief is that we see peri-implantitis for that reason primarily, which is why we're not very successful with our periodontal type treatment of peri-implantitis. So, looking at the implant systems I'm showing you today, there's a way of eliminating that. But there's also a way of eliminating overloading. We asked a computer, 1993, how should we support a full arch of teeth? We'd got good mathematical modelling by that stage, so we could tell the computer 12 teeth, we could tell the computer parafunctional force is 300 to 400 kilograms, and we could tell the computer you can use one implant, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, up to 12 implants, and you can put them in any angle. And the program came out with 4 implants. That's not a surprise. We keep making chairs, like the ones you're sitting on with 4 legs. So we've kind of reinvented the wheel. But the thing that was interesting is that the computer told us we must put the distal implants in at 45 degrees. Well, that's not a surprise, because I could be standing here 150 years ago with a very tall top hat, being very proud of myself because I just built a bridge across one of the biggest rivers in Britain using cast iron and A-frames, 45-degree frames. I built it, Isambard Kingdom, Brunel, for horses and carts. But you guys, you're driving 39-ton lorries over it. My engineering is still there, even though it's cast iron. Cast iron is a brittle material, it's not strong. We didn't have steel 150 years ago. So if we look at the mechanics, that computer has reinvented Victorian engineering. If we put the roof on a house, we use A-frames. So the force of the tiles and the snow is spread out to the walls, so the roof stays up. So that's why you see those implants tilted like that, because the main problem in implant dentistry is parafunction. It's what the patient does when you and I and they cannot control what is happening. The jaw is a class 3 lever. It's hinged at the back. It's like a nutcracker. If I give you a nut, you'll push it to the back of the jaws of the nutcracker to break it. So if I'm clenching, the maximum force is on my molars. But if I haven't got molars, it will be on the most distal tooth in the mouth. So if I've got a 5 on one side, but I only go back to the 3 on the other, it'll be that 5 which then fails. And we look at it and we say, well, it's got a pocket and it's mobile, must be periodontal disease. Yes, but no. It's actually overloading that's causing the bone degradation and the inflammation. It's not primarily a bacterial disease. It's mechanical. So if we're going to build a situation like this, we need to have understood what we're doing. We're letting the patient sleep. That is unfortunately a necessity. And if they're going to sleep, they're going to clench. Psychologists refer to dreaming as nature's emotional flush toilet. We all have to go through the dreaming cycle to deal with what happened to us today, what we anticipate happening tomorrow. And we get into situations every night where we are going to put large forces on our teeth during that dreaming cycle. We can't avoid it. We stick a night guard in there, we make the situation much worse because our mouth guards tend to be the same thickness from the anterior to the posterior. It forms therefore a wedge. Close to the hinge joint, the forces on the molars increase. Night guards in full arch dentistry wreck implants and full arch prosthetics. So we have got to get our prosthetic design right. The first thing is we mustn't go too close to the hinge axis, so no more than 12 teeth ever. So this is the implant system. And you're saying, well, how can you call it an implant system? There's 3 different sorts of implants, or maybe even 4. Well, the whole point about these is that we moved on from this type of implant that you can see there, which is effectively a Brannemark implant. We then had Nobel Biocare design speedy implants, which are bullet-shaped, so they'll spread the bone better. And then we had Drive, which is a very aggressive thread. And this particular company has put these together and developed Alvim, which is a very nice implant. It'll go in easily, even into hard bone, which is what a parallel-sided implant is designed to do. But because it's tapered, it can also spread soft bone and compress it. Obviously, the surgeon has to make a decision about how wide he drills the osteotomy. So if you're dealing with soft bone, you keep it narrow, and you increase your primary stability from the implant by spreading the bone, i.e. effectively forcing the implant into a narrower channel. So once you've chosen which implant you're going to use, you now need to attach something onto it. So the great thing about this particular system is that it has this wonderful connection, very long, thin, narrow taper. So the 2 pieces of metal absolutely lock together, and to help them lock, you've then got a little screw going through here that you can tighten up. But you don't need to tighten it up very much, because the Morse taper here grips, rather like putting 2 flower pots inside the other. And if you think about the Victorians, most of the medicines that they administered were actually in liquid form. So you can still open up an old Victorian chemist's bottle and find that those medicines are still sterile. And that's simply because they used glass and they ground a Morse taper into the top. And by pushing the glass stopper in there, they produced a bacteria-tight seal. That's what we're doing when we have a long, thin taper like that. A Morse taper is what holds the wheels on a Formula One car, because bolts rattle loose. So Morse tapers are actually much better, more secure engineering. A Morse taper is a taper that is less than 6 degrees. So the two components lock together. So this screw holds the abutment into the implant, and you can choose an angle. You can either have a straight abutment, a 17 or a 30, so that enables you to cope with this decision of having the posterior implants at 45 degrees to the occlusal plane. This particular implant also has a double thread, so it goes in twice as quickly, but much more important than that, it goes in straight, because the screw starts in two places 180 degrees opposite each other, whereas every other screw is a bit like a man on a bike. It wobbles from one side to the other as it goes into the material that you're screwing it into. So if you want to, you can decide how to reference that angle by having a 6-sided hexagon inside. You don't have to. You can choose abutments which don't have that hex, in which case you have 360 degrees of flexibility of where you place that abutment. Now that is important, because if you've got your posterior implant at that angle and you've got a 30-degree unit coming out of it like that, where it sits is going to have an enormous effect on where your screw access is. If you've got it coming right through the middle of the 6 on the occlusal surface, that's a nice prosthesis. If it's coming out lingual or palatal, that's uncomfortable on the tongue, may potentially make the prosthesis too narrow. And if it's out to the buccal, it doesn't look very nice for the patient to see a little repaired access cavity. So by using this type of system, we can save on chair time, because if we haven't got that little hex inside, it's much, much easier for us to place the abutment after we've put the implant in, because we have such a degree of flexibility. We can get that access absolutely exact. The screw is only holding that little taper together. The taper is self-locking. It's a Morse taper. The screw doesn't need to be very tight. So it's not doing a lot. Therefore, it doesn't come loose. If we look a little bit later on what I'm talking about here, some implant systems have screws that come loose 25% of the time in 5 years. This system, it's only 1.5% of the time. That makes a massive difference to whether you're going to get any inflammation, bacterial growth, because if the screw comes loose, there's space, or whether you're going to have to go back in and redo your prosthetics, or if your prosthetics breaks because it's actually on a mobile platform. And then this particular system has just one aperture in every single implant. So you can use any abutment on any of the implants that you've chosen. Doesn't matter how big the implant is or what the external shape of it is, the attachment is exactly the same, which makes it very easy in the surgery. You have a set of abutments, you have a set of implants, and you can place the ideal implant, and then you've always got an abutment to fit into it. So don't just take my word for it. I only do about 40 arches a year. This guy is doing about 4 times that. And having changed onto this particular Neodent implant system, he's found that even at these high success rates that we're getting, he can get another 2% of success just by having changed the implant system. That is amazing. But don't just take his word for it. Let's take another big implant user. And again, this guy is doing 166 arches a year. It's quite a few implants. It's worth reading through that. It's quite interesting to see the different breakdowns. The one that's interesting to me is the fact he does 55% of double arches. I think what we're beginning to do these days is to identify mouths that are hopeless. There is a point where a tooth becomes a liability, not only to the patient's comfort and chewing ability, because a painful tooth can stop them chewing and they're better off without it, but an enormous liability to the patient's general health. We frequently observe in our patients who have poor health that their life improves, their face improves, their complexion improves. The diabetics change from their doctor nagging them that they're not controlling to being absolutely stable about 3 weeks after we do their clearance. So here's a different system. You can imagine now what the difference is. That is a 6-sided box. It's very short. It's even called a conical connection, which is a bit of a cheek. The cone is just there. It's like a nut stuck on the bottom of a teacup saucer. That's one of the ones that comes loose 25% of the time. Because if you put a box inside another box, there must be a small gap. You can't get a box that's the same size as the other box inside the other box. One has got to be smaller than the other. That means there's a gap. So anything that's vertical-sided is going to be a motorway and a sump for bacteria. Here's another flat sides, vertical faces. That's a motorway to bacteria. It doesn't matter if it goes, I'm certain it's fitted. That's not the point. The point is, have I put a well full of bacteria at the level of the bone? Here's another one. Again, a bit of a cheek. It's called a conical connection because there's a little cone shape at the top. But those screws come loose as well because it's not a locking taper. It's just two tapered faces sitting against each other. So the secret is that length. And here you can see the choice between having an internal hex to stop it rotating, to give you a reference if that's what you want, which is what you do need for a single tooth, or whether you go for the flexibility of being able to choose 360 degrees of placement, which is unimportant for a straight, but really useful when there's an angle, because as you turn it, this one's going to face in lots of different directions. So here's the sort of thing that I'm doing just to show you some clinical stuff. What we're aiming to achieve is placement where the implant is actually below the level of the bone, so that by the time we restore it, the gum is actually here. Here is the bone, and you can see that we've trimmed the bone flat as soon as we've taken the teeth out, so we've got a good sensible table to work on. And then we've just left a little ridge, because obviously as you come in at an angle, the front face of the implant is going to be a little higher than the back face. And we need a little space here to be able to slide this in. We must avoid the back corner of that resting on the bone, otherwise we might think the screw is tight when it actually isn't. I've lost my timing device. How am I doing? Thanks. So once we've got the abutments in place, we then need to take a full arch impression. So these are simple cones with long screws. So we tighten those down exactly to 10 Newton centimeters torque. So we know that they're not loose, they're all equally tight. And then we will go on to link them together if we want to follow a very precise prosthetic process. My own belief is that we do this because we're in a rush and it slows us down. I don't think it's necessary. It's what we teach people to do when they start taking implant impressions, but I think we should just teach them to slow down. In my practice, I find that if I take a good putty impression and I wait so that it is absolutely set, I don't get any distortion or any inaccuracy in my frameworks, and I'm doing full arches, which is supposed to be the most challenging situation to get accuracy. I think the problem is that we're always trying to get in and out of the mouth so quickly. So we take our impression materials out before they've had the manufacturer's 6 minutes. 6 minutes is a long time. We take them out at 3.5 because they feel okay to a prod. So if you're going to rush, then this makes it accurate because this really slows you down. You get some dental floss, you weave a little cat's cradle around those posts, and you slowly dab on some pattern resin, let it set. It's rock hard. It definitely will not distort. And if you're really worried, then you go and break one of your dental instruments and sort of stick that across the back as well, and then it really can't wobble anywhere at all. And then you take your impression over the top. Another neat way out of that problem is to go back to the Victorian era and take a plaster impression. It's very quick, it's incredibly cheap. And of course you then don't need to do all of the linking up because the plaster is so solid, it cannot distort. So once you've taken the impression, it's important that you've checked that these are exposed, and then usually in the top of these there's a little bit of putty. You need an ordinary dental probe to flick it out, and then you can get your driver in and just undo the screws, and it lifts out incredibly easily, much more easily than when you're taking it off teeth. Teeth are barrel shaped, there's a lot of undercut to pull against. This just lifts off because of course the metal components are just sitting on top of each other. So you can then go on with the laboratory procedures. You can produce a soft tissue model and then produce your plaster model over the top if you wish. And that's how it looks in the laboratory. And this is typical of the things that we're doing. My own desire is that technicians shouldn't use this for full arch work because I like to see the tissue compressed. So if the whole thing is plaster, you can take a scalpel along the top here and just trim off 1 millimeter before you start making your bridge. So when you actually come and screw it down into the mouth, you compress the gingivae. It's much better for aesthetics, but particularly it's another bacterial seal. These are the various components you've got to choose from. So the one that's commonly used for immediate placement is this one. So you have had a denture made. You've put some type of impression material in it and you've placed it over the top of the abutments. So you've got a little dent where each one of your abutments is. Now this is being done on a model. If it was in the mouth, of course, there would just be blood here because this is immediately post-implant placement. So we've taken the teeth out, we've flattened the bone ridge, we've put the implants in, we've sutured, and now we're taking impression. So we're ready to immediate load. And this is the trick. Having taken those references, you've got an idea of where you're going to go through. Go through with a small burr. You go through with a big denture trimmer, it'll catch and it will crack your prosthesis. So we are doing this in the mouth. It's on the model just so it looks clean. So you've got your titanium tubes. You may have had to drill some of these down so they're not fouling the occlusion. You're then going to put a rubber dam over the top to protect your tissues, and then you're going to check that it seats, check the occlusion. You may do that directly visually, or you may have a putty bite from the articulator, and you will then flood the underside and place it over the tubes, and having filled these with PTFE tape, which looks like wide, thin dental floss, 99p a roll from B&Q. much better than cotton wool. Or you can do this technique where you're using a very fine tip and injecting it here. But I've got to tell you that clinically, there's a bit of a risk if you get any of that down there that you really will have problems getting the screw back out. So PTFE every time. This is a quick way of doing it. The lab can have produced that big open aperture for you, but it's going to be weaker because you haven't got any of the original acrylic which the denture was made from, and therefore you're only relying on something which will set in the mouth, therefore it's a weaker construction. But those are two different methods of basically doing the same thing. So once you've finished, you then cut the pallet out, you cut down the buckle, you reline it, which this is not showing, so that it is going to compress the sutured soft tissue, and then you fill with PTFE tape, which again this is not showing, and then you put a sealing resin over the top of it. And this is the kind of result that you will get. So a double arch here, and you can see the occlusion is absolutely spot on. Thank you very much.